you know, in many ways, the conference went as was expected. Starmer's big speech was a big speech. It was certainly big, but it was pretty vacuous, pretty thin on content. Indeed, I'm afraid I'm running out of superlatives to describe its emptiness. And reading about it, even the papers and the journals and so on that would normally be sympathetic to Starmer's sort of position were not really very enthusiastic about it. I think if we're going to understand it, we have to take it in conjunction with his magnum opus, The Road Ahead, which was a document that he issued in advance of the conference, and was to sort of give potential voters and supporters an idea about his politics. And I have to say that that too is pretty empty, pretty vacuous. And I think it's very interesting to compare Starmer's lack of very developed ideas beyond a series of cliches and sound bites with, say, Labour leaders in the past. Even, I'd say, Labour leaders who were coming from the right always had some sort of theoretical basis. They drew on certain aspects of the Labour tradition. Indeed, they emphasised that Labour tradition, or they referred to the Fabian tradition. Neil Kinnock drew a lot on Eric Hobsbawm's Forward March of Labour Halted and some of the politics of Marxism today. And of course, Tony Blair, who Starmer is alleged to be modelling himself on, drew on the third way politics of Anthony Giddens and communitarianism. In other words, there was something of substance there, even though it was a fairly reactionary set of politics. It was clearly based on some sort of tradition. But in this instance, I'm afraid it was a fairly empty performance. And it was clearly designed, I think, to fit in with his electoral strategy. Starmer's advisors had sort of cobbled this one together, I think, and they're drawn from the old Blairite school. One of his main speechwriters, Philip Collins, was a speechwriter for Tony Blair, and his chief of strategy is Deborah Mattinson, who's recently written a book on why Labour lost the election. And she's a sort of guru of the focus groups. She's the sort of person who gets a group of people together, gets them to discuss certain issues, and strangely enough, they come to the conclusion that people want the sort of politics that Starmer is coming up with. So what was in the speech? Well, there are a number of themes and a number of elements, but both in the speech and in the advanced booklet, or the essay, The Way Ahead, or The Road Ahead, sorry. These were emphasis on cooperation with business, a very modified form of capitalist reformism, cooperation with the state, with the status quo, and in particular a number of sort of key trigger messages. For example, crime. Labour would be crack down hard on crime. This is where Starmer refers to his previous role as DPP, and also emphasis on security in the sense of security for voters in terms of their work and their place in society, but also in terms of an uncertain world. And this is where we got very much the ideas of patriotism. Labour was a patriotic party. Labour wasn't afraid to defend the armed forces. In other words, this was a speech tailor-made for the type of voters it was alleged that Labour had lost in the last general election, very much working on the idea that large numbers of working class voters who abandoned Labour were patriotic, that they were turned off by Jeremy Corbyn's pacifism, his sense of maybe betrayal of British interests, those sorts of, fairly reactionary, socially conservative views all were in here. And of course, the idea of the contribution society, which was meant to be the big idea in which everybody plays their part and is then justly rewarded. So very much a reformist idea of leaving the social economic order intact, but making sure that everybody played their part and did the right thing. We even had the reappearance of our old friends, the hard-working families, and they've got a look in again. Presumably, these are the people who work hard, are struggling, and who Labour hopes to appeal to in that way. So it's very much sort of Blairism. And I suppose the big question for us in both the political and the economic sense is whether that's going to work. After all, it worked in the 1990s. And, you can easily see how with a group of Blairite advisors around him, Sakia thinks that it's possible to repeat the trick again. But I suppose it's a bit like all revival acts. A lot of people go along to see a Beatles tribute band because, well, they like to remember the good times. But if you look in the charts, I'm afraid the Beatles and bands of their ilk aren't there anymore. There are other types of music. People have moved on. It's not a musical discussion, but I suppose the point I'm making is that what's happening here is that just merely to repeat the words and the phrases of the 1990s in a very different world isn't, I think, going to cut it electorally. And indeed, what's interesting when we look at the poll ratings in the few days afterwards, is that Keir Starmer was in fact unable to shift up. If anything, the gap between Labour and the Tories has remained, and indeed, Keir Starmer's own approval ratings are still in minus figures. So we have the situation then in which a Tory government, which is facing no end of crises, both self-inflicted and in the wider sense, is still has a poll lead, and in which Labour has not convincingly established its position. So from that point of view, the Starmer strategy doesn't look to be that successful. But I think there's also something else about its failure, and that is that really British politics have really radically changed, and indeed the world has radically changed since the 1990s. First of all, we've got Starmer, the arch Remainer, who was very clearly identified with the Remain cause, even down to the level of a second referendum. And in many senses, as we heard when someone heckled him at the conference, was blamed for losing Brexit voters for Labour. We've also got really the whole sort of shift in world politics, the rise of China, the tensions between the United States and China, and indeed foreign policy as well, the AUKUS agreement between the United States, Australia and Britain. And that sort of feel-good, positive set of vibes, things can only get better, we were told, under Labour in the 1990s. We're definitely in a much more insecure world in which the possibilities of conflict and indeed of major crises really loom on the horizon. And whether Starmer's Blair tribute band approach is really going to work, I think, has to be really put into question. We're also in a different world economically. The 1990s were a period of economic growth, and the economy was quite buoyant. And on the basis of that, people felt that Blair might offer them something new. Starmer is operating in a world of slumps, of economic crisis, and a sort of steady as she goes policy doesn't really, I think, cut it. So that, for example, on energy prices and on issues of public ownership of the utilities and the £15 an hour minimum wage that was being proposed by many in the party, his agnosticism and indeed opposition to that, I think, don't even in terms of electoral politics, don't really answer that. I suppose above all, the type of Blairite economic strategy, which depended upon fairly heavy taxation of the city, of a booming financial economy, that again isn't, I think, going to wash. Again, it's going to prove to be very difficult. So the positive dynamics that Blair had, we can't really see being present for Keir Starmer. So it looks, I think, in the initial run that Starmer's gamble in terms of the speech, in terms of his pitch, is really open to question in that way. But of course, he wasn't just appealing to the electorate. He was also appealing to a much more important audience for a leader of the opposition and a potential prime minister, and that was the ruling class in Britain. He was more or less saying to them, as he said really since his election, I'm a safe pair of hands, I'm reliable, that the dangerous experiments of Corbynism, particularly the threat to Britain's alliances, its relationship with NATO and the rest of the major capitalist countries, that that threat has gone. No more wild experiments, no more flirting with Palestinian rights. Above all, no more flirting with any sort of really serious intervention in the economy. Corbyn's policy wasn't particularly radical. It was for managed capitalism at best, and in many ways it was a fairly moderate program. But Starmer's even rode back on that. The other audience for his speech wasn't just the British ruling class, but of course it was the American ruling class, the dominant international ruling class, and again they were very concerned about the future direction of the British Labour Party. But Starmer has reassured everybody. He's brought everybody back into line, and Labour is now being groomed as the reliable second 11. So normal business resumes, no more radicalism, a safe pair of hands. And if the ruling class feels it necessary to switch and to back Labour, then it's not a risk in the same way that was the case under Corbyn. However, I suppose if we're thinking about the perspectives from the conference, is how far Starmer can, in a sense, pull Labour back as an electoral force. I've mentioned the opinion polls, and I've also mentioned some of the theories that exist in the right about why Labour has gone into decline. In the various journals associated with that wing of the Labour Party, the journals like The Guardian, The New Statesman, Prospect, and so forth, a lot of argument about the historical decline of Labour and about the need to develop a patriotic appeal to the so-called red wall seats, a type of politics of blue Labour. That decline has gone on for quite a number of years. And although Peter Mandelson, who's also involved behind the scenes with Keir Starmer, would like us to believe that that the defeat in 2019 was solely attributable to Jeremy Corbyn's unpopularity, we might also consider that Labour votes, and particularly Labour majorities in many of their safe seats, have been falling as well. And the big dips occurred in the 2000s. Indeed, as many people on the left point out, Jeremy Corbyn actually gained more votes for Labour than in some of the elections in the 2000s. And this sort of much vaunted 3 victories in a row were often on much reduced votes. And that, I think, does pose for many people, and it's certainly raised on the left, of the possibilities of Labour going into some sort of long-term decline. The writing on the wall in Scotland, and indeed in parts of the country which had been safe Labour seats for generations, all seem to pose, I think, some sort of threat. So this sort of mood, I think, was quite evident, and has been quite evident in the Labour movement for a while. Does Starmer have a sort of long-term strategy? What are the prospects? What prospects does it have for remaining leader for any appreciable time? There's been, I think, some discussion of this. What was very interesting for me, being present at the conference as a visitor, was to compare what I was reading in the newspapers and seeing on the television with what I witnessed with my own eyes. And in that sense, it's very clear that a number of Starmer's colleagues have, certainly got their eye on the top job. The little spat with Angela Rayner, the Tory press seem actually quite obsessed with her, and really big this question up. But also the way that a number of Blairite politicians like Andy Burnham, remember Burnham was in Blair's cabinet, and although he's distanced himself from that now, he's very much part of that scene. But also Dan Jarvis, Labour MP in Yorkshire, and a Metro Mayor, or shortly I think will end that role. Rachel Reeves, Wes Streeting, all of them were sort of said to be on manoeuvres, parading themselves around as potential alternatives. And so Starmer was not only, I think, appealing to the electoral audience, he was not only trying to reassure the ruling class, but in some ways he was trying to hold this rather sort of disparate right-wing group together. But of course, we are in a period of some great instability and uncertainties. And as we know from elections and from politics in the last few years, any number of surprises can occur. And indeed, in the conference itself, there were a number of surprising developments. And again, the contrast between the way the conference was reported and what was happening on the ground, as it were, in the conference floor, was, I think, very interesting. And that contrast was particularly the way that what the political spin meisters describe as the narrative, as the optics. There was a narrative here that Starmer was clearly in control. The optics were of a popular leader, someone who'd seen off the left and was now firmly in control of his party, that had really taken on the left. And indeed, the reception that his speech got, with a number of heckles and demonstrations and so forth, although those demonstrations were quite significant and much larger, I think, than many people had expected, they still, certainly the projection of them, both in the television and the newspapers, was that Starmer had seen off the hecklers. Indeed, he prepared for that. What was quite interesting to comrades who were actually there was that he prepared for a couple of heckles, but then had actually run out of steam. And indeed, his responses got rather lamer and lamer. So he probably expected 3 or 4 heckles, not the round of heckling. And he certainly didn't expect much of the response that he got. So I think that this shows again the degree that within the conference there was a degree of opposition, and that some of the arguments about the left having been seen off, not always accurate. If we look very closely at many of the conference votes, they often gave Starmer a majority of around about 60 to 40. They varied, and indeed on a number of quite significant issues, the left managed to win. Notable victories were on the resolution condemning Israel as an apartheid state, on condemnation of the AUKUS deal, that new alliance with the United States and Australia, and also on the on aspects of the Green New Deal and the economy. But of course, Starmer can sort of ride pretty well roughshod over that. Even when the resolution in Israel was passed by acclamation, not put to a card vote or even a show of hands, really. Lisa Nandy said, well, you know, we can more or less ignore this, and Starmer likewise. So although these represent, you know, signs that in the conference the left was still active, what it wasn't in a position to do was really to bring Starmer to heel. And on many occasions, Starmer was saved by the trade union bloc votes of a particular number of unions, the GMB, the Unison delegation, and USDOR, all in sense could be wheeled out to vote for him. These right-wing unions still see Labour as a means of obtaining some concessions for their members, and they still have hopes the Labour government will be able to deliver those. So they're sort of fairly firmly behind Starmer. But in the constituencies sections and in some of the other left unions, it's very clear that there's still a degree of opposition. For me, the interesting thing was the nature of that left wing, and this, I think, shows really the current state of the Labour left. And although the Labour left was not as badly seen off as many people had feared, it was very clear that it was in a weakened situation. It's also clear that since the general election, that Labour has lost maybe 150,000 members. Figures are really thrown around in general. It's very hard to get hard and fast evidence, but a number of constituencies didn't send delegates. And indeed, in my experience, some constituencies are now losing up to a third of their members, maybe even more. Meetings are in quorate, and indeed there's a sort of an air of demoralization setting in amongst people. So although there was a clear fight back, and indeed there were some excellent speeches in the conference, it was clear that when it mattered, that Starmer had the votes in his pocket. And this, I think, is evident in two areas. One were the constitutional changes, which would make it much more difficult for a leadership candidate to stand. Also changes which even further entrenched MPs in their seats and made them even less likely to be removed or democratically accountable to their constituency parties. But probably the major blow was the acceptance of the disciplinary procedure, which more or less brought in the whole arguments of the EHRC report and handed disciplinary matters over to an independent panel. Indeed, comrades who are there will perhaps tell you that the whole mood at the conference when those measures were discussed was very subdued, and indeed one comrade described it as if the conference was performing a collective act of penance, and that everybody in a sense had bought into this narrative about the party needed to have independent scrutiny of its disciplinary procedures, and that might mean that actively hostile groups such as the Board of Deputies of British Jews might be involved in internal party disciplinary matters. So that really did represent something of a defeat for the left. There were, apart from those areas that I've mentioned, that were victories for the left, but as I've said, these are in many senses Pyrrhic victories. Starmer's sort of setback early in the week when he floated those ideas of changes to the election structure, reintroduction of the electoral college, a reintroduction of the electoral college, which would, apparently or allegedly reduce the influence of the left. That was seen off by the unions. It's unclear, how far this was a case of bad tactics by Starmer, floating something only a few days before the conference, and indeed whether there was some sort of tactical nous lurking behind this. For those of you who play chess or study military history, some blunders can often appear to be very deep tactics, and you always have to look at an apparent mistake, I think twice. But it does seem to me again that this was an example where Starmer was trying to, maybe again repeat something from the Blair playbook, and that it was all designed to be a demonstration of his authority, and maybe to go for that Blairite tactic of trying to win wider support by going on the offensive against his own party in that way. Likewise, his success in getting David Evans appointed as General Secretary was again another example of his strength. But also, again, as comrades who were there will tell you, it was also an example of some of the most blatant manipulation, gerrymandering, playing around with the rule book, or simply ignoring the normal rules and procedures. So the conference majorities that Starmer got were not, I think, were not simply this sort of massive onslaught by the right. Indeed, in some senses, the left did maintain a link. But what I think is very much missing from the left is really any sense of direction. And this, I think, is what we need to consider in our discussions, and really where Labour is going to go from here. We're definitely, I think, in the post-Corbyn era. Some comrades on the left are still hoping that Jeremy Corbyn will do something, rather like Jacobites meeting in their secret rooms and toasting the king across the water. The argument is that that Jeremy might be the catalyst for something. Quite what that something is, I think, is unclear. And this, to me, is really the weakness and the problem of the Labour left. This is not really a question of the personalities of the individuals concerned. It's not even about the record of people like Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell when they were in the leadership position, and when they really stood idly by as comrades were expelled, witch hunted, or when they really failed to take the fight to the right. When, for example, there were the various attacks upon Corbyn, they didn't launch a purge of the PLP. They didn't encourage the constituencies to deselect these people. They just simply stood by and, in a way, were rather passive about the whole thing. So I think we need to consider what that tells us about the Labour left. And again, I don't think these are sort of moral defects. They are, I think, political weaknesses. And indeed, they come from the politics of the Labour left and their key focus, which is on the election of a Labour government. Now, comrades on the Labour left have a variety of positions, but I think the central position they all have is it's necessary to elect a Labour government. Any Labour government is better than a Tory government. And indeed, for many of them, the idea that socialism will develop incrementally through a series of left Labour governments is absolutely central. So that means that the Labour Party must be kept intact, and that it does, in of necessity, mean a set of concessions, set of compromises with the Labour right. The left always sees itself as weak. It always sees itself as relatively unable to shape events. And so it's necessary always to compromise, to maintain the structure of the Labour Party in order to achieve that. And of course, we've seen really that the Corbyn movement has generally either receded, with many people simply leaving the party when faced with the defeat of the election and the failure of that project. They didn't really have a perspective other than getting Corbyn into power and then expecting that Corbyn would, do it all for them. The politics of the savior from on high. And those politics are never going to work. That our conception of politics, our conception of socialism as a movement that's based on the self-activity and the self-emancipation of the working class, do not rely upon that sort of Führerprinzip. Doesn't rely upon leadership. It relies upon a very clear strategic movement. Also, many people on the left, many people who were formerly on the left, have in a sense come to terms with the new order. Many people who came into the party have either settled down for a new career. Many of the momentum enthusiasts have managed to link their own personal careers to what they see as political principle. They work as advisors to MPs. They're aspiring councillors. Some of them are on the lookout for seats. And so, in a way, they've become part of the Labour bureaucracy. And if they haven't really joined that Labour bureaucracy, they have really come to terms with it. Others, perhaps more principled, but not, I think, really particularly very strategic, are simply holding on, digging in, getting into the shell holes and just hoping that this will all pass over and that they will then be in a position at some future date to regain control over the party. They're waiting for better times ahead. They take comfort that they're holding on. And of course, that sort of policy often goes alongside a fairly sort of quietist policy towards fighting bans and prescriptions, taking on the witch hunters. And of course, they will, preserve themselves for another day, but they will only do that, I think, in the hope that Labour is the only show in town. Quite what they're going to do with Labour, they don't really seem to know. One of the problems, I think, with the defeat of Corbyn and therefore the defeat of his movement was that Corbyn himself was, in a sense, the central figure. Corbynism, I think, was a very interesting phenomenon, and it still, as I say, has a certain resonance. But Corbyn, as a politician, was a person, rather like an empty glass to whom you could pour all sorts of content. Corbyn was the authentic voice of politics. He was principled. He was very much the outsider. He'd spent years on the back benches promoting unpopular causes. Even people who thought of him as maybe a bit too left-wing in the PLP did admire his tenacity on certain subjects. So in that way, he carried that aura of principle. It's really a very long way from the rather machine, slick politics. But of course, Corbyn's own strategy was, I think, really seriously flawed. And even leaving aside his strategy for socialism, which, as I've said, was really very little more than a form of managed capitalism of some alleviations of the worst excesses, and that in a period when I think it's very difficult for capitalism to give those sorts of concessions. But his strategy for achieving that there will be many comrades on the left who will have many experiences of being under attack during the Corbyn years and of making direct links, in some cases in my own Labour Party, people appealing directly to the leadership. They had personal contacts with people like John McDonnell and Jeremy Corbyn. And in a sense, just simply being abandoned. And indeed, in many cases, comrades were simply thrown under the bus in that way. And that, I think, is not only unprincipled, but it was just strategically inept, that simply to placate the right wing and hope that that would buy you time wasn't going to work. So any movement that's focused on Corbyn, and I think again we all know the way that the Momentum movement did that. Any movement that's focused on Corbyn, with his departure from the scene, is likely to disintegrate. Who are the runners and riders from the left for any leadership challenge? Who indeed are the runners and riders for any form of real fight back on the left? And we can name maybe a handful of people. Richard Bergen made a very good speech at the Socialist Campaign Group rally, well known, writes in the Morning Star. John Trickett, likewise, starting to gain that sort of reputation. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if Andy MacDonald, who's not a member of the campaign group, I think, didn't start to make some running as well following his resignation. But I think the other sort of moves that we have now on the Labour left are ideas of turning our back on Labour, particularly after that speech and after that conference, and building some sort of new party, some sort of new movement. And we've heard all sorts of arguments about that. Ken Loach has called for a new movement that might encompass people both inside the Labour Party and outside of it. We know that large numbers of people have left the Labour Party, and that indeed many people are now becoming more interested, more involved in protest politics. There are demonstrations today on outside the Tory party conference. And it's also very likely that in the coming months, there will be trade union struggles. Workers in a period of inflation will attempt to recoup some of their wages. And of course, with labour shortages, workers will want to make up for all the attacks that have been had on them really for decades now. So there will be other fronts opening up. But what is the perspective for these sorts of movements? What form could they take? Well, some comrades are talking about a new specifically socialist party. I'm in favor of a party with a clear revolutionary socialist program. I'm a Marxist, and after all, that's what I want. But many of the programs and many of the arguments that are being put forward are often fairly broad. They're often only united by the lowest common denominator of opposition to Starmer. And indeed, on quite fundamental questions, they still, in a sense, accept the ideas of Labourism, of focusing on elections, of getting into government, of taking control of the state machine. So this focus on electoralism, I think, will be a weakness. And likewise, some comrades believe that the Labour Party should, in a sense, be reclaimed, should be rebuilt. So a new Labour Party Mark II, a Labour Party that might, for example, include some of the unions that have disaffiliated, RMT, Bakers who've just disaffiliated, linked in with socialist activists, and that again could be the basis for a new working class movement. But of course, the weakness of many of these is the focus on participation in the capitalist state, and indeed the belief that that elections, you know, are the central focus, and electoralism and the formation of the government. And as Marxists, we don't accept that it's possible to achieve socialism in that way. That simply a series of Labour governments or a series of left governments are going to be allowed to carry out the sort of social change, but also that our conceptions of socialism really revolve around the mass involvement and the mass political mobilization of the working class as a whole. So any new parties that are likely to emerge, I think, are likely to sort of go the way of many of the previous attempts to form a party outside of Labour. Respect is an example. Arthur Scargill's Socialist Labour Party, Scottish Socialist Party. You know, there are any number of projects like this. And I'm not at all confident that any of the ideas that are currently being floated are likely to take us very much further. The problem then for Marxists and for socialists in and around the Labour Party is what sort of demands and what sort of programme to advance. In any number of discussions that take place, the comrades from LPM, Labour Party Marxists, put forward two sets of demands. Pardon me. One of our central demands is not the idea of reclaiming Labour. Labour, after all, has always been what Lenin described as a bourgeois workers' party. It's always been a contradictory party. It's always had its starmers. It's always had its members of the establishment at the top. It's always had its trade union bureaucrats. So from at least since the First World War, when Labour went into coalition and Arthur Henderson sat in a cabinet which ordered the execution of Irish Revolutionary Socialist James Connolly, it has been firmly on the side of the capitalist class. And indeed, it's very clear that someone like Starmer is actually a part of that ruling class. Despite his constant references to his toolmaker father, his own individual position is not what counts. It's actually his social role and the fact that he's an integral part of that state, that part of that legal establishment. But of course, Labour is also a working class party. It has its roots in the trade unions. And of course, for many people, particularly when they first become involved or become interested in what they think of as socialism, the Labour Party will be an arena for them. So it's still rooted in the working class. And as such, it still remains an arena for socialists and for Marxists to struggle for their politics to win support. But Labour in and of itself, given this historical contradiction and given its function, can never, I think, become the revolutionary party. It can never generate within and of itself that type of politics. It can never develop that revolutionary program organically. For that to occur, there does need to be a party external to Labour, and that, I would argue, is a Marxist party with a very clear Marxist program. So our demands are not for the reclaiming of the Labour Party, but for its refoundation as a united front of the special kind, of a party that goes back to its origins as a movement that includes all socialist and working class tendencies. In other words, that it's an arena in which we can build the revolutionary movement, not seeing Labour as it's constituted as an instrument, but seeing it as an arena in which we can fight and build that sort of project. Unless we're looking at that sort of party, unless we're looking at that sort of project, then I think that turning our backs on Labour is a mistake. Labour still has a very important place in the British working class movement. We can't ignore it. But neither can we simply argue that we stay on in Labour and just keep our heads down. We have to fight for our politics, but we also have to fight for a wider strategy and a wider political programme. And it seems to me that many people on the left, although they're asking these questions, have yet really to arrive at those sorts of conclusions. In the next few weeks, next few months, I'm sure that comrades who were on the Labour left will be discussing these things. There are 2 or 3 meetings in the next few days, and we'd urge comrades to go along to them, take part in the discussions, but to do so with a very clear strategy and a very clear understanding about the nature of the Labour Party, but also to understand the history of that party and to understand the history of projects that have been designed to create a new party outside of the Labour Party, not to repeat the mistakes of the past, but to go for a very clear strategy and for a very clear Marxist programme. Okay, comrades, I'll leave it there and we can then begin the discussion.